If you could summarise capitalism, what it is, as succinctly as possible, what would you say capitalism is?
Well, capitalism is a system in which capitalists use money to make more money. And the classic way in which they do that is they go into the market and they buy means of production and they buy labour power and they put it to work and they make a commodity and they sell the commodity. And at the end of the day, they end up with more money than they had at the beginning of the day. And then the next day, they take some of that more money and make even more money. So capitalism is a constantly expanding system of accumulation of wealth and power in capitalist hands.
And how old would you say it is as a system?
It had a merchant form way back in the 15th, 16th century, but the industrial form really came in the 19th century, which was when you started to employ wage labour in large factories, and then they were the ones who created the value which capitalists could then appropriate at the end of the day when they sold the commodity that had been made.
And capitalism isn't as smooth and as simple and as easy in making that process happen as some would like us to believe. So what are the contradictions within that process of capital accumulation?
Well, capital accumulation is a sort of continuous process, and at any moment there could be a blockage. I mean, I can take money and then I can look for labour power, and maybe all the labour is on strike, so I can't find the labour, or I can't find the means of production because all the iron ore has run out, or all the resources have run out, or something of that kind. And even when I get the production process going, there could be all kinds of things go wrong with the technology. And then when I've got the commodity, I've got to find a market for it. And if I've made something that nobody wants, then all that effort I've put in goes to waste. So there are many points where, in fact, the circulation process of capital can come unstuck. And if you think of it as a continuous process, then any break in the continuity means that actually there's going to be a crisis for capital.
And big question, can capitalism as a system, the industrial capital that you're talking about, the industrial capitalist model that you're talking about, that began in the 19th century, can that end? And if it does or can end, what comes after it?
Well, there are a number of problems with this system. One is that it's about continuous growth. And this arises because capitalists reinvest some of their money. I always think, well, if they were normal people, they would just take the extra and consume it and have a good time. But they can't do that because they're in a situation of competition with other capitalists. So if they don't reinvest, others will, and soon they'll be driven out. So the result of that is that capitalism is a system which is about continuous growth. And growth compounds, and as it compounds, it gets larger and larger and larger. So what we've seen since the 19th century is a capitalist system that's expanded geographically in intensity. More and more commodities are coming on market. Now, if you think about that process and say, can that go on for thousands of years? The answer is no, it can't. Now, when it's going to come to stop, when it's going to hit barriers, we begin to see some suggestion of limits right now. And at some point or other, we have to think about another way of making life decent than capital accumulation.
The story of what's happened since the fall of the Berlin Wall, since the Chinese and much of the sort of global South labour market's been absorbed into the global labour market, the big story is that actually poverty's been reduced. And poverty, as understood as, subsisting on less than $2 a day, has declined dramatically in the last 2 decades. So what do you say to those people that go, look, in the global north, in the west, the microwave I've just bought is as cheaper than ever, and at the same time, those workers in Guangzhou are seeing rising living standards. So what's the problem?
Well, the problem is with the data you're telling me. I mean, there are different ways to measure the data. It's true that actually in China, for example, people now are better off than they were, say, 20 odd years ago because of the processes you're talking about. But if you look at the social inequality in the world, you'll see an immense increase in social inequality between the very, very rich and the rest. For example, in the United States, where I came from in 1970, generally speaking, the chief executive made about 30 times as much as the average employee. Now they make 350 times as much as the average employee. And we've got billionaires popping up all over the place at the same time as we find people are actually more and more kind of in a state of poverty. And be careful about that $2 a day, by the way. Yeah, some people are getting now $3 a day, but what can you buy with $3 a day? And if prices go up, and we see actually prices going up, and one of the reasons why you're starting to see revolutions in North Africa and so on is rising food prices and the like. So when somebody kind of says, well, once they were getting $2 a day, now they're getting $3 a day, and isn't that better? Then you say, yeah, but what can they buy with it? It turns out that actually it's not as good as those data you cite make it seem.
Right, because this definition of sort of the global middle class, right, which we're told is now massively expanding. This is going to provide a big new market for the exporters of the global north. These are new markets now in China, Brazil. Yeah. This new middle class, it seems pretty rickety as a middle class conceived, right? Because it's $12 a day.
You're seeing a middle class emerging in countries like China, and it's stronger in India and so on. But at the same time, the middle class is under assault. For instance, even in the United States, the middle class is diminishing, and there's more and more people in long-term unemployment. There's more and more people who are just not entering into the labour force. And there's a lot of misery and despair going on in groups that used to be satisfied with a middle-class style of life. So, it maybe look good over here, but it's not so good over there. That's the big problem.
Classical liberal response to everything you just said, they say, well, fine, look, okay, inequality within countries and between countries has dramatically increased since the mid-1970s. That's beyond doubt. But if the pie is getting bigger and the poor, yeah, they get a diminished slice, but actually that slice is still a downside better than it was in the mid-1970s, then where's the problem? I mean, that's the argument that
John Rawls would pitch, for instance.
Yeah, so I've heard that story since I'm a young kid. I mean, I'm old enough to remember it in the 1950s that we were going to get rid of global poverty by capitalist development, and then 20 years later they kind of said, well, we've still got this global poverty problem, and then 20 years after that, I always remember Henry Kissinger saying in the 1970s, we'll soon do away with world hunger, and here we are, 50 years later. Still, there's a lot of hunger around, and there's a millennium goal of 2000 when they said, okay, by 2015 we're going to get rid of global poverty, and we're very close to that, and it hasn't happened. The difficulty here is that actually capitalism as a system thrives on actually diminishing the standard of living of the labourer, because by keeping wages repressed and wages down, profits become higher and higher. And the result of that is that capitalism creates poverty. It also creates unemployment, because unemployment is one of the levers to keep the aspirations of working class people down. So actually capitalism produces poverty, it produces unemployment at the same time as it thrives on that, and then it turns around and says, well, we've got all this surplus, maybe by allowing us to continue, we're going to get rid of poverty. But I've heard that story since the 1950s so many times that I think it's time everybody woke up and said, no, you can't use a mechanism that creates poverty to get rid of poverty.
If we go back to 2008, AIG, Lehman, Bear Stearns, the whole palaver, it looked like the end of a certain kind of capitalism. For many, actually, they're now realising it was probably just the beginning of what had preceded 2008 being put on steroids, so to speak. So that crisis of 2008 and its consequences, diminished wages in much of the OECD, specifically North America and the United Kingdom in particular, massive unemployment in Southern Europe. How big is that crisis? Because initially it was being compared to the recession of the early 1990s, and then they said, okay, well maybe it's as bad as that of the kind of the late 1980s. Gradually people started talking about the Great Depression, or indeed the 1870s. So within a historical context, how big was the crisis of 2008?
Crises are always about creative destruction, and one of the questions you have to ask is who's benefiting from the creation and who's bearing the costs of the destruction. Officially, we came out of the crisis in 2009, if you look at profit rates. profit rates recovered by 2009. By 2009, even the financial sector had been bailed out, most parts of the world, successfully. So capital was doing all right. And actually, if you look at the data, what you'll also see is the top 1%, as we famously refer to them now, actually came out of it by 2009 very well and have actually increased their wealth and power very significantly since 2009. So you would say that for the wealthy and for capitalist corporations and for capitalist businesses, the crisis is effectively over in 2009. The difficulty was that actually for most of the people, this was not the case. That unemployment has not recovered, has not been cured, and we've got a very, very sort of serious problem of diminishing living standards. The share of wages in national income has continued to decline. In fact, it's the continuation of the neoliberal mantra we've heard since the 1970s, which is, keep labour under wraps, keep the wage rate down, and capital accumulation can spiral on upwards. So what we've seen is creative destruction, and a certain class, a group of the class, has actually come out of this very well. Whereas the mass of the population, which relies not only on wage rate but also on state expenditures, because also we've got this mantra about austerity in state budgets, people who rely on that are much worse off. So there are certain people who are bearing the costs of the destruction, and that's actually the mass of the people, whereas the capitalist class and the billionaires club is getting richer and richer. I mean, Oxfam did some calculations and suggested that the increasing wealth of the billionaires club in 2012 would have been sufficient to actually cure global poverty. I mean, but that's not happening. That's not where the wealth is going. It's going into a few people's pockets.
So if 2008 was the big event for capital in recent years, 2011 might be identified as the big year for contentious responses to that crisis. You've just pointed out the Arab Spring, of course, but there were movements across much of the global north as well. Spain with the 15M, the J14 in Israel, of course Occupy primarily in the US, but elsewhere as well. Did Occupy now, 3 years have passed, did Occupy fail? Because it seems to me there was a historical opportunity to advance broad demands that could have created cross-class coalitions, precisely the thing you think is necessary, and you cite towards the end of your most recent book. Did Occupy fail in doing that?
I don't think Occupy actually was even started, really, in a sense. It was a voluntaristic, immediate kind of movement. And in fact, what we've seen around the world over the last 20 years is more and more events which are just eruptions of discontent. I mean, here in London, there was the kind of the riot. What we've seen in Brazil just recently is another example. What we saw in Taksim Square. There are these eruptions of discontent, which to me signals a broad global discontent with the conditions which are actually arising out of the way capital is working these days. Occupy was one of those events, and it started, and it had it was a fairly small movement, even though it was claiming to represent the 99%. It was a small movement that made those claims. And what was interesting to me, well, two things were interesting. One was, in a very short time, they changed the conversation, and actually to the degree that we're talking about social inequality now as an issue, and to the degree that, for example, in New York City we have a mayor who's dedicated to doing something about social inequality, though frankly he's not going to be able to do it, and to the degree that this issue has come back into even Obama's speeches and so on, has everything to do with Occupy having changed the nature of the conversation. And it's interesting. Everybody now knows what people mean by the 1%. And it's almost become a piece of our own kind of political discourse that we talk all the time about the 1%, and everybody knows what we're talking about. So Occupy was successful in changing the conversation, and I think that's been important politically. The second thing was the speed and the violence of the reaction of the forces. I mean, the way the police came down on it so fast and so hard suggests to me that actually there's a deep fear on the part of the bankers and the Wall Street crowd and the 1% that actually a populist movement of this kind might actually get teeth and might get claws, and that they would be endangered in some way. So in New York, for example, what we saw was a billionaire mayor being instructed by the billionaires of Wall Street to get the police out and kick these people around. And that's, the violent response of political power in relationship to Occupy was very marked compared to, say, the lack of any response of that kind to the Tea Party. The Tea Party could go out there and they could take stuff from the, National Monument or something like that, and nobody did anything. But Occupy was a real threat. I don't think they realized how much of a threat they probably were, and I don't think they ever managed to consolidate it. They have not gone away, of course. We're likely to see them resurgent in some way. And I think that those kinds of movements, as we've seen in Gezi Park in Istanbul, as we've seen in about 50 cities around Brazil recently, these movements are not dead. They're alive and well, and I think we're going to see a lot more of them. One of the big issues is how do they consolidate into something which has a coherent plan of campaign, as opposed to voicing discontent and voicing protest songs and protest music and all the rest of it.
Intelligent conservatism has always been characterised by a great quote from Thomas Macaulay, reform so that you may preserve. It's also a similar line said by Prince Tancredi in De Lampedusa's Gattopardo. We have to change everything to keep everything the same. To what extent do you think that elites are aware of the nature of this crisis and the nature of the possibility of those kinds of contentious responses to that crisis, and that they are capable of adapting to new conditions and actually mitigating what may be a really contentious, politically powerful response? Or do you not see that coming? Because beyond the occasional George Soros quote, I don't really see it.
No, I think the elites are divided. They're divided now by national. The billionaires club in India is very different, and Russia is rather different from elsewhere. So I don't think they have a consolidated view. There are some of them, like Soros and Buffett and the big philanthropists, who think that there's something that should be done. But by and large, I don't think the elites have an idea of what to do, because what they see, and I think this is again very significant, what they see is that the repressive apparatus, the policing apparatus, the surveillance and the power of the state can be fairly easily used to crush any movement of this kind. And I think that this is going to sometimes be done violently. In other cases, I think it's going to be simply controlled through infiltration. And I mentioned the violent response to Occupy Wall Street. We see a violent response in Turkey, for example, to what happened in Gezi Park. And I think that this is an ongoing issue, and I think right now, to the degree that there is any consolidated response on the part of the 1%, it's let the state take care of it. We give them, we elect them, we control them. Let them turn the police dogs on the people, and we can preserve our wealth that way. And there's very, very little empathy, I think, within the top 1% for the conditions of life of the mass of the population right now.
So if the powerful, from Erdogan's Turkey to the United States to Spain, Italy, the UK, if the powerful are saying that perhaps we can no longer rule through consent, and where that's not the case, we have to resort to coercion, in that context, of what use are institutions and electoral processes for those who want to change things?
I think electoral processes are, and I think most people are convinced that electoral processes are pretty useless, and that's a pretty strong conclusion. That the so-called democracy we have is really the democracy of money, power, and that there's nothing much that can be done. And there's continued hope that maybe you can do something different. For instance, I mentioned we have a liberal mayor elected in New York City who has made some gestures about what he wants to do, but what's immediately clear is the Wall Street power structure has moved in very, very fast and has put a corral around his possibilities. They've essentially bought the Democratic governor of New York State, so the Democratic governor of New York State now disciplines the one person in the Democratic Party who might actually try to deliver some sort of transformative politics for the mass of the population. So again, I think the political people recognize the political process. Well, they may be wrong to do so, but I think there's a great frustration with the electoral process, and out of that, what we're beginning to see is what I would suggest is a new way of doing politics, which involves things like the protest movements and things like setting up assemblies, regional assemblies, trying to set up self-governance structures and so on, to do politics by other means. It's not got very far, and what form it will take and how it will institutionalize itself, I think, is yet to be seen. But I think what we're seeing is a kind of a bypassing of the state and the bypassing of the political process, and an attempt to do something different, as we see in Spain through the Indignados, and as we've seen throughout many of the more continuous process movements that have existed in different countries.
Final question. Are you an optimist?
Depends which day of the week. On Thursdays I'm an optimist, on Friday I'm a pessimist, and then I go back again. It depends on the situation. I think there's a lot of room for hope, actually, and so I would not say I'm a universal pessimist, but there are some days when I look at the situation and I say, how on earth can everybody tolerate the idiotic way in which this world is being run in the face of some very, very simple solutions which could be arrived at simply by being decent human beings and saying, look, let's everybody have a good share of the pie, let everybody join into a collective kind of process of self-governance. And so I think there's a sense of that around, and I encounter that, so I get very optimistic, but then I look at what happens on the news and I kind of go, this is terrible.
Okay, thank you very much.
All right.
Cheers.